are. Okay, everybody, what is up and welcome back to Reaction Sundays. That is right. We're going into another form of motorsports. We're going into F1. And with that, we're going into the secret evolution of F1 cockpit. That being said, let's go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit that like button and share and all that other shit. But yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into the reaction. Let's go.
The cockpit is the inner sanctum of an F1 car, and somewhere fans rarely get to see. Steering wheels now offer drivers the information they need and the ability to make changes at the flick of a
Microphone,
switch.
yes.
But
Okay.
things haven't always been so
Look
advanced.
at all the
We
fucking
invite you
dials.
into the secret world of F1 cockpits and show you the
it's a beautiful
amazing
helmet.
systems and technology F1 teams try to hide. One look into
There you go, you just saw who this is by. He has another video by the evolution of the F1 helmet.
So when we look at cars from
Go
the
check that out.
50s,
I'll put a
we can
link
see
of it
things were
down
much
into the
more
description, at least to his channel.
The engines were big,
Down in the
4.5
description.
litre units running on alcohol, and they ran big carburetors and had to be bump started. There were no clever electronic control management systems. In terms of switches, there would be a couple for things like the ignition and the fuel pumps. Drivers got the information as to the condition of the engine via instrument dials on the dashboard and through his ears, listening out for any changes in the engine tone. The dials were basic but included the essentials: engine revs, oil pressure, battery voltage and water temperature. He would have to know from experience what all these dials should be reading, and if he spotted a problem, he'd make a judgment call to come back into the pits or to carry on. Compared to today, the steering wheels tended to be fairly large. This was because they needed the leverage a big wheel offers, due to there being no power steering. That also defined how the driver sat in the car. They'd be upright and able to haul the wheel through direction changes. Pedals were fairly straightforward with the conventional accelerator, brake and clutch. But due to the cars being front-engined at this time, the drivetrain ran between the driver's legs, so he'd be straddling the tunnel containing the prop shaft. His feet would sit either side of the bell housing. This meant his left foot was on the clutch and totally separate from the brake and throttle. That was until 1957, when Cooper introduced the T43, the first mid-engined F1 car. Not having to sit on top of the prop shaft allowed the driver to be much lower in the car, and his feet were now closer together. Also, it must have been fairly comforting for him not to have a solid rotating metal shaft spinning at many thousand RPM right between his legs. Changing gear would be fairly familiar
because if
with
those
8-pattern
explode,
gearboxes, but that
legs
had
are
to be
going
done
with it.
carefully, as those gearboxes were particularly fragile at this time. Into the 1960s and the cars had become smaller and more streamlined, meaning cockpits were much less spacious than the cars in the previous decade. In the 50s, the driver sat upright and on the car. In the 1960s, the driver sat in the car. He was surrounded by the framework of the chassis with panels covering the tubes, which created a bucket seat profile. The driver was much more reclined, lowering the car's centre of gravity. With being so low, small curved aero screens were made from clear perspex instead of the larger glass screens from before. But the controls and dials all stayed pretty much the same, the only slight change being the addition of an engine warning light. These would light up if there was a problem with the oil pressure and alert the driver straight away. Towards the end of the 60s, regulations were brought in to help with safety,
Yeah, it makes sense.
so seatbelts and fire extinguishers were made mandatory. In the 1970s, most cars were running the Cosworth DFV engine. They were relatively simple and there were no clever electronics to play with just yet. But one big change was that the cars were no longer built using tubular space frame chassis. They were instead made from an aluminium honeycomb forming a monocoque tub. These tubs were stronger
Smart.
and formed even more of a natural seat shape, resulting in simple padded panels to get the driver comfortable. Harnesses were improving, now being fixed to the car in 6 places. More attention was being paid on what the driver was wearing as well. We've done a video about the Evolution helmets, so check that out in the link. Although the new type of tub was stronger, its main function was to improve handling. There was still no real consideration of using the structure to protect the driver in a crash. The tub came up to just above the driver's waist, with the arms and shoulders being totally exposed, protected only by flimsy bodywork. The steering wheel was now much smaller than it was before, with most having the addition of an emergency ignition switch so the driver could kill the engine should the throttle stick wide open. Towards the end of the 70s, there were some very clever designs which saw speeds increase both from engine performance but also from grip. The cars all ran skirts, or vertical planks, that formed a seal from the bottom of the car's side pod to the track surface, creating what is known as the ground effects. This gave a huge boost to aerodynamic grip, by literally sucking the car to the floor. With cornering speeds rocketing up at the start of the 80s, the governing body, the FIA, brought in new rules to rein it all in. They raised the minimum ride height to 60mm, which lifted the skirts up off the floor and completely stopped ground effects. This is where some very clever solutions were introduced by the teams to get around the rules. The cars had to pass a minimum ride height test when it came back into the pits. So, some teams installed a lever in the cockpit which was connected to the suspension. When driving out the pits, the driver could lower the chassis so the skirts touched the floor. Then, they would raise the chassis, ensuring they passed the ride height test as they came back into the pits. More features started to be introduced into the cockpit for on-the-fly tweaks, including roll bar adjustment, allowing the driver to move the handling balance of the car through the race as the fuel and tyres changed.
I like how pretty much all of that is on the steering wheel now, but back then it was like, it was still here.
Brake loading, moving it forwards or backwards as the car's grip and balance changed as well. Aluminium was the main material still being used to construct the chassis, but in the mid-80s, carbon fibre started to become more common. This light and strong material meant the chassis could be made even smaller, reducing further the space for the driver and the controls. Still, with no bodywork on the car, you can just see how open the cockpits are. Turbos now featured in most cars, so a boost gauge along with a rev counter became the most prominent dials, but there was still the traditional analog style. In truth, a driver doesn't need to know exactly what the oil pressure or the battery voltage is during a race. Just as long as they are within the correct limits, that's fine. So, with space being a premium, those gauges started to be replaced with a series of warning lights. If a warning light comes on, you can make the call as to whether to carry on or pull straight over and retire. In the late 1980s, the ability for the driver to talk to the team via the race radio started becoming commonplace. So a button was installed within easy reach on the wheel, and gearboxes now featured up to 6 speeds, all changed with a short, stubby lever. Despite the highly advanced materials now being used elsewhere, some drivers still favoured a crafted wooden gear knob. At tracks like Monaco, a driver would be changing gear around 2,730 times over the course of a race. A fair amount of that race would be spent with one hand on the wheel. Drivers often tore their hands to shreds and would tape them up like a boxer inside their gloves. During the era of digital watches and the Sinclair Spectrum, the 1980s saw pit garages start to fill up with banks of computers. Data logging had arrived. McLaren were at the forefront of this technology. Their MP42B ran a digital fuel readout that calculated how much fuel was left in the tank. Prost used this to great effect, pacing his drive in the 1985 San Marino Grand Prix as others ahead ran out of fuel. Prost crossed the line in first, with just enough fuel to make it back to the pits, although he was later excluded for being underweight. In 1989,
because he ran it low on fuel.
The Ferrari 640 designed by John Barnard, which transformed the way we change gears in racing and road cars to this
Less
day.
fuel equals less weight.
Featured a unique paddle shift gearbox system. The paddle sat behind the steering wheel with an easy reach for the driver's fingers, meaning that his hands never had to leave the steering wheel. It made for lightning fast gear changes and completely removed driver error from the electronically managed gear shift process. Interestingly though, one of the main driving forces for Barnard to develop the system wasn't to make the driver's life any easier. By getting rid of the gear lever on the right hand side of the driver, the tub could be made narrower and it helped a lot with aerodynamics. It promptly won on its debut in Brazil, with Nigel Mansell driving. But thereafter the car proved to be hugely unreliable. Both cars and Mansell and Gerhard Berger only finishing 8 more of the 31 races they entered between them. But when it did finish, it was fast, and it led the way for others to follow in the future, with the last fully manual gearbox being seen in the uncompetitive 40 FG01 in 1995. As cornering loads increased, the physical demands on the body rose too. Seats became shaped to the individual driver, ensuring a snug fit. In general, the seats were made by taking a mould of the driver sitting in the car using expanding foam. This was then used to exactly replicate the driver's shape in a carbon fibre shell along with some padding for comfort. So aside from the outlier of the Ferrari 640, from the first race cars in the 50s up until the end of the 80s, pretty much the only change in the cockpit was how the driver was positioned and how much space they had around them. All of the controls were totally recognisable to the driver of any generation. Then the 90s happened. A cosmic explosion of technology meant F1 cars started their evolution into the 220 mph technology labs that we know today. Electronics got smaller and designers were now able to cram more and more tech into their cars. Telemetry systems could now send real-time data straight back to the pits as the car was lapping. That development allowed the team to direct the driver to make changes to the car via an ever-increasing array of switches and dials. One of the main dials a driver would use would be for adjusting the engine map, altering settings in the car such as fuel injection revs and the profile of the throttle curve. It's exactly the same features you can find in some road cars today via the Sport button. The king of cars
Or the
in this
Eco
era
button.
was the
You're trying to save fuel.
FW14B, which is, even to this day, considered one of the most advanced F1 cars of all time. Not only did the driver have to cope with adjusting the variable traction control and ABS, they also had to deal with the mind-bendingly complex active suspension system too. There were now an ever-growing number of buttons and dials, all of which battle for space in ever-shrinking cockpit environments. Necessity is a great driving force for progress.
He barely has
And the fact
room
that
to
the
move
engines
his
were now
hands.
revved to over 20,000 RPM meant the needle on the rev counter just simply couldn't keep up. These free revving engines buzzed through their range so quickly even digital LCD screens would be a blur of changing numbers. So a simple system of shift lights was introduced. A driver doesn't need to know the exact number of revs the engine is doing, they just need to know when the optimum time is to shift. The simple solution is to have a number of shift lights timed in stages to let the driver know when they are approaching the shift point and the exact moment to pull the right hand paddle to change up. With cockpits becoming so small, there was less and less space to put dial switches and the information displays. These started to migrate
Little
into the wheel.
LEDs, they take up
This was
next to no
beneficial
room
to
in
the
the board
driver
that's on them.
because as his
Nothing.
workload increased, it meant both hands could be kept firmly planted on the wheel. The wheel also became less wheel-shaped. In a race car, you're always trying to keep your hands in the same place, typically in the quarter to three position, unless your name is Jean Lacy. The steering lock of an F1 car is so small, you'd rarely ever have to take your hand off the wheel, so the need for a top and a bottom of the wheel became less important. Up to the mid-90s, the driver's head was still exposed, and if they were a tall driver like Damon Hill, you could still see their shoulders too. This changed in 95 when the sides of the cockpits were raised, starting the trend of building more car and more impact absorbing materials around the driver. In the late
Smart.
90s, most cars now ran a clutch lever on the wheel instead of a pedal. By removing the pedal in the footwell, this meant that designers could narrow the front of the car even further, helping with aerodynamics. It also reduced weight by getting rid of a whole pedal mechanism. In 1997, however, a car appeared on the grid which reverted back to a 3-pedal layout. The third pedal, though, was not a clutch, it was a second brake. The McLaren MP4-12 featured an additional pedal, which only worked on the rear brakes, known as a fiddle brake. It was operated by the driver as they accelerated out of corners, helping to eliminate understeer and turn the car into high-speed bends, similar to how tanks work. It was banned the following year. Into the 2000s, and you
Something
would now
works so
find
well.
around 20
Ban it.
buttons and dials on the wheel. With throttle, clutch and gear changes controlled by electronics, these were all open to manipulation throughout the race distance. One of the key areas for adjustment would be to change the differential and how it delivered its torque, which had a big impact on the car's handling. 2010, and again McLaren came up with a very clever trick to give themselves more straight line speed. By diverting some airflow through a snorkel on top of the tub in front of the driver via some channeling and onto the rear wing, they were able to stall the rear wing, drastically reducing drag. Ingeniously, this was all achieved with no mechanical movement, which would have been illegal, but simply by the driver moving their left leg to cover a hole in the tub. Every team chased to catch up and made their own, but they couldn't put holes in the tubs as they'd already homologated them, so they had to make do with systems using air holes closer to the open cockpit. This resulted in drivers taking a hand off the wheel when going down a straight, and sometimes both if they had to make another adjustment at the same time. KERS, or Kinetic Engine Recovery System, was introduced in 2009, which added another layer of complexity to the car's and the driver's workload, with more settings to change and adapt to through the course of the race. Then in 2011, we saw DRS, or Drag Reduction System, be introduced to try and encourage overtaking. When activated, the rear wing moved into a flatter plane, so
and then you just
reducing the
go.
drag. This of course could only be used when the car was in a straight line, and it was activated by the driver pushing a button on the wheel when they were within 1 second of the car in front. But it was 2014 when the workload really escalated for the driver. Huge regulation changes brought in much smaller 1.6 turbocharged combustion engines, combined with a complex engine recovery system. Enormous amounts of parameters could be changed as the race progressed. Steering wheels now featured over 25 individual buttons, dials and scroll wheels, some of which have numerous positions or dual functions. Tactics are key to winning a race, so teams routinely use coded radio messages to tell the driver what setting to select, adding yet another layer of complexity to the process. It's very hard to put an actual price on one of these steering wheels. Any part of an F1 car is totally bespoke, but it's fair to say when you include all of the R&D, you could definitely buy a very nice sports car for the same money. The safety of drivers
Or
has
a
become a key factor in
fucking
the sport.
steering wheel.
Single-seaters have always been open cockpits. It's part of their DNA. It's undoubtedly part of the thrill of driving them, and it's also part of the thrill of watching them. To see a driver working at the controls and to see their helmet flash by reminds the fans that it truly is more than just the machine trying to go through a rouge without lifting off the throttle. However, this layout has always carried its risks, and in recent years a number of instances forced the sports governing body to search for a solution. There have been anti-intrusion panels made from Xylon added to the side of the tub. The most prominent change to the safety regulations, though, is a somewhat controversial halo. It's there to stop large objects contacting with the driver's helmet, such as wheels, or indeed other cars. Since its introduction, there have been a number of crashes where the halo has played its part, and despite concerns, drivers say once you've driven it a few times, you don't notice it, and it just becomes part of the car. A 50s racer would most likely feel very confined and cramped in the narrow tub. And the
There's not
reduction
only
in
that
vision
either,
of the
it's
high
just also
cockpit
the fact
size would
that
definitely be off-putting.
I think IndyCar
Firstly,
did better
put a
because you
modern
basically
F1
have a
driver
halo,
into a 50s
and you
car,
also have a windscreen
given
to
the
help
fact they
block
can
some of the
actually see
smaller
floor,
debris.
plus the lack of seat belts or any real safety gear, that would leave them feeling hugely exposed, and most would refuse to drive it at speed, let alone go wheel to wheel with other drivers. There is nothing like driving an open-top car, and hopefully any improvements in safety over the coming years will still allow the fans and the drivers to keep this unique experience. If you enjoyed this, go check out our other videos on the evolution.
Right here. I will most likely be leaving a link down into the description of this channel. Go check out other things that this guy has put out. They're amazing videos. You want to learn more about F1? He's the man to go see. That being said, I will see y'all later. Bye.